My husband told me he had a job site walkthrough in Clackamas on Saturday morning. I found his truck parked on Birchmore Lane instead. 2 blocks from nothing, in front of the pale blue Colonial I grew up in, the one we sold 3 years ago to cover the last of my mother's hospital bills. I didn't stop. I kept driving at exactly the speed limit, a bag of groceries in the back seat, a podcast about nothing playing on the stereo, and a very specific feeling in my chest that I recognized immediately because my mother had described it to me once, the sensation of a floor dropping out before you can see where it lands. I need to give you some context, because the story I'm about to tell you is not the one I thought I was living for the first 3 weeks I was inside it. My name is Celia Hargrove. I teach high school English in Beaverton, Oregon, which means I spend a lot of my professional life asking teenagers to look for what a story is actually about underneath the thing it appears to be about. It turns out I needed that lesson applied to my own life. I've been married to my husband Sawyer for 6 years. He's a structural engineer, the kind of person who notices load-bearing walls at dinner parties and apologizes about it afterward. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party when I was 27. I was immediately suspicious of how genuinely kind he seemed, because I'd grown up watching my mother be let down by men who were very good at seeming kind. She raised me alone on Birchmore Lane after my father left when I was 4 years old. She worked as a night shift dispatcher at a regional freight company for 22 years. She was the most competent person I've ever known, and she died of ovarian cancer 18 months after her diagnosis, on a Thursday in April, in a room with a window that looked out over a parking garage. Before she got sick, she'd owned the house on Birchmore outright. She'd made the last mortgage payment the month I graduated from college and called me from the driveway to tell me because she wanted to share it with someone. By the time the bills started coming, the house was the only real asset she had. We sold it 11 months into her illness. She never went home again. I tell you all of this because otherwise what Sawyer did doesn't make any sense. And for 3 weeks, I was completely convinced it didn't. The Saturday I drove past Birchmore Lane, I came home, put the groceries away, and said nothing. Sawyer got back 2 hours later, smelling like sawdust and cold air. He said the Clackamas site was a mess. The contractor had flagged 3 issues that were going to push the timeline. I nodded and handed him a cup of coffee. I had always been good at being calm when I needed to think, which is useful when you teach teenagers, but is apparently also useful when your husband is lying to you about where he spent his Saturday. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up our bank statements. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking the way you look when the light is wrong in a room, and you can't figure out why, scanning for whatever doesn't belong. I found it in 18 minutes. Cash withdrawals. Not large, $200 here, $150 there, spread across nearly 2 years. Consistent enough to be a pattern, small enough not to trip any alarms. Every Friday, withdrawn from the same ATM 2 blocks from his office. I didn't sleep well that night. I didn't sleep well for 3 nights after that. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't cry in the shower or call my best friend in a panic. I did what I always do when something feels wrong and I need to know if I'm right. I gathered information quietly, without showing my hand. My therapist has called this a survival strategy with some maladaptive tendencies. She's not wrong. I waited 2 more weekends. Both times Sawyer said he had a site visit or a client call or some variation of a reason to be somewhere else on a Saturday morning. Both times I had a quiet, specific certainty that he wasn't where he said he was. On the 4th week, I hired a private investigator named Hector, a semi-retired man who had spent 20 years in the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office and now worked out of a one-room office in Northeast Portland. He was precise and not particularly warm, which was exactly what I needed. I didn't want someone who would hold my hand through it. I wanted someone who would find out the truth and tell it to me plainly. He called me 11 days later. "Your husband goes to a property on Birchmore Lane," he said, "every other Saturday for several hours. He arrives alone and leaves alone. No other individuals enter or exit while he's present. Any sign of another person? Messages, phone calls?" Not that I observed. I want to be direct with you, Mrs. Hargrove. In my experience, this doesn't look like an affair. It looks like a project. I thanked him and hung up, and then I sat very still for a long time. Not a person. My house. I pulled up the county assessor's website that same night. It took 11 minutes to find what I was looking for. The property at 4427 Birchmore Lane had been purchased 14 months earlier. The buyer was not a developer or a real estate investor. The buyer was my husband. I won't pretend I processed this correctly. I didn't. I sat there looking at his name on a public record and felt something I can only describe as vertigo. Not because I thought something was wrong, but because I couldn't find the shape of a reason that made any sense. We had not discussed buying a house. We had definitely not discussed that house because I had told Sawyer exactly once, about a year before my mother died, that I didn't think I could ever talk about selling it. He had never pushed me to. I thought about every reasonable explanation and found a problem with each one. I thought, maybe he bought it as an investment and doesn't know how to tell me. But then why the cash withdrawals? Why the lies about his Saturdays? I thought, maybe he found something in the house and is waiting until he understands what it is. But that was too specific to be likely. That was me reaching for a story I wanted to be true. I called my mother-in-law. She and I have what I describe as a politely careful relationship. She lives 30 minutes south in Lake Oswego in a house that is immaculate in a way that feels like a statement. She has never been unkind to me, but she has always seemed vaguely uncertain about me. The way you're uncertain about a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit the room but hasn't broken anything yet. I told her I knew about the house. I used that phrasing deliberately because it was true and because I wanted to see what it did to her face. She went very still. "Does Sawyer know you know?" she said. "Not yet." She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "Celia, this isn't mine to explain. You need to hear it from him. Tell me if I have something to worry about." She looked up. "No," she said, and it was the most direct thing she had ever said to me. "You don't." I drove home. I didn't confront Sawyer that night or the next. I needed the full picture, not a version of the truth handed to me in a state of accusation and defensiveness. I'd learned from years of teaching that a cornered person tells you what they need you to believe, not what's actually true. The following Saturday, when Sawyer said he had a walkthrough in Clackamas, I said of course, drove to the coffee shop 2 streets away, waited 20 minutes, and followed him to Birchmore Lane. I parked down the block and walked. The house looked different than I remembered. The front porch had been repainted. Not the institutional beige it had faded to when we sold it, but the original pale yellow from when I was small, before my mother repainted it the summer I started middle school. She'd always said she regretted changing it. I used to think that was a strange thing to regret. I went up the front steps. The door was unlocked. The inside smelled like sawdust and fresh paint, and something underneath both of those things that I can't name, but that hit me in the sternum the moment I stepped across the threshold. The particular smell of a place that was once yours and hasn't entirely stopped being. The floors had been refinished. The kitchen had new fixtures, but the same layout my mother always had. The hallway was exactly the same width it had always been, which sounds like a meaningless thing to notice, but when you grow up in a house, you absorb the geometry of it in a way that doesn't leave you. I heard movement upstairs. I walked up, second door on the right, my old bedroom. Sawyer was on his knees in front of the window seat, the long built-in bench that ran the full length of the east wall below the double window that looked out over the backyard. My mother used to sit there to read to me at night. She kept extra blankets in the storage compartment underneath the cushion. When I was small, I used to hide things in there, notes, drawings, a shell from a beach trip when I was 7 that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. He heard me before he saw me. He went completely still. Then he turned around. I had prepared things to say. I had been preparing them for 2 weeks. I didn't say any of them. "The window seat," I said. It was all that came out. "I'm restoring it." He didn't stand up. He was still kneeling, holding a piece of trim in one hand, and he looked at me the way people look when they've been found at the beginning of an explanation they hadn't planned to give yet. The storage hinge was broken. I was going to fix it before I showed you any of this. "You were going to show me?" "Yes, on our anniversary, Celia. I needed it to be finished first. I didn't want to bring you here to a construction site. I wanted you to walk into it whole." I sat down on the floor. Not because I was overcome, though I was, but because my legs had simply decided that standing was optional. "How long?" I said. "I started looking at it about 2 years ago. It came on the market 14 months ago. It needed a lot of work, which is why the price was low enough that I could. With the savings and a small personal loan I didn't. He stopped. I should have told you. I know that. I'm not asking you to tell me I was right. Why didn't you? He set the trim piece down. He looked at his hands. Your mom asked me something about 6 weeks before she died. I didn't say anything, I waited. She asked me if I thought there was any chance of getting it back someday. The house. She said she knew it wasn't realistic. She wasn't asking me to promise anything. She said. He stopped again. When he continued, his voice was quieter. She said the thing she felt worst about, out of everything, was that you'd grown up loving a place, and she'd had to take it away from you. That you'd never tell her it mattered because you didn't want her to feel worse. And she said she knew there was probably no way, but if there was ever a way, she hoped someone would find it. The room was very quiet. I didn't tell you, he said, because I didn't know if I could actually do it. I didn't want to give you hope about something I might not be able to deliver. And then when I found a way, I was scared that if I told you before it was finished, you'd walk in here and see it half broken, and that would be the memory. I wanted you to see it like this. Like what? I said. You're still on the floor with a piece of trim. Like almost done, he said. I'm 3 weekends away. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted across the room and lit up the dust in the air. Eventually, I said, show me what you've done. He walked me through every room. The kitchen, new countertops, same layout, original cabinet hardware sourced from an architectural salvage shop in Selwood. The bathroom, retiled in a color close enough to the original that I almost didn't notice. The hallway, refinished hardwood in the exact shade that had been under the old carpet when my mother ripped it up this summer. I was 12 and decided the carpet had to go. He knew that detail because I had told him once, years ago, in the middle of some rambling conversation about childhood. I had not thought he was listening with the kind of specificity it takes to replicate it. When we got back to my old bedroom, he lifted the window seat cushion and opened the storage compartment. I found something when I was fixing the hinge, he said, a few weeks after I got the keys, pushed all the way to the back. He handed me an envelope. My mother's handwriting, my name on the front, in the blue rollerball pen she bought in bulk from the office supply store near her job. I recognized the particular slant of the C before I even registered reading it. Inside was 2 pages, folded into thirds. I stood at the window while I read it, because that felt right. My mother had written it sometime in the last year of her life. She didn't date it. She wrote about the house, about how she'd brought me home from the hospital to this room, about the window seat specifically, how she used to sit in the chair in the corner when I was a newborn and watch me sleep, and feel completely overwhelmed by the fact of me. She wrote about my father, briefly, without bitterness. That she had come to understand that some people aren't built for staying, and that it had taken her many years to stop taking that personally. She wrote about the night she'd made the last mortgage payment and called me from the driveway, how she'd cried a little after she hung up, not from sadness but from a kind of completion she hadn't expected. And at the end she wrote, I don't know who will live here after us, but I hope they are happy. And I hope you know, wherever you are when you read this, that I made something real here. We made something real here. Even the things that broke. I stood at the window for a while after that. Outside, the backyard had gone golden with October. The maple tree she'd planted the year I started kindergarten was still there, taller than I remembered, which makes sense because 22 years is a long time for a tree. Sawyer didn't say anything. He stood near the door and waited, because that is something he has always known how to do, to be present without requiring me to perform anything for him. Eventually, I turned around. You should have told me, I said. Yes. Even if it wasn't finished, even if it was a construction site and you weren't sure yet, you should have told me. I know. You're right. I hired a private investigator, I said. I found your name in the property records. I went through a lot of different versions of what I thought. He closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. I know you are. But the secrecy cost us something, even if the thing you were hiding was good. Do you understand that? Yes, he meant it. He wasn't arguing, because there was no argument to make. It was simply true. I looked around the room one more time. How much is left? Porch railing needs 2 more coats. Upstairs bathroom fixture needs replacing. The trim on the window seat hinge. He paused. 3 weekends. I want to help, I said, with the last 3 weekends. He looked at me for a long moment. "Okay," he said. We drove separately back to our house, made dinner, and talked for a long time. Not about the house, about the space around it. About what it means to try to love someone well without letting them into the trying. About the difference between a surprise and a secret, and how thin that line gets when the secret is about their grief and not yours. Sawyer is not a person who talks easily about these things, and neither am I, and that conversation was harder in some ways than standing in my old bedroom holding my mother's letter. Sorrow has a shape. What we talked about that night was more shapeless. What we owe each other when we love each other, and how you make sure the form your love takes is one the other person can actually receive. I didn't forgive the secrecy instantly, because it wasn't a small thing to have lived with for 3 weeks. The bank statements, the investigator, the drive past the house with my heart going sideways. That was a cost, and I said so, and he heard me. We found out later that the woman who lived next door, Pearl Dawson, 79 years old, who had been on Birchmore Lane since before my mother moved in, had been the only person outside of his mother who knew what Sawyer was doing. She'd introduced herself the first Saturday he showed up with a truck full of lumber and a confused look at the fuse box. She'd known my mother. When I finally introduced myself a month later and explained who I was, Pearl told me that my mother used to bring her tomatoes from the garden in August every year without fail, and that she used to hear me practicing piano through the walls in the evenings when I was small, and had always found it comforting in a way she'd never thought to mention until now. She talked about you constantly, Pearl said, standing on her front porch with her coffee mug in both hands. Celia this and Celia that. I always felt like I knew you before I met you. I asked if she'd known about Sawyer's plan. I figured it out after a few weeks, she said. He's not very subtle when he's carrying plywood. I didn't say anything. He never asked me to keep quiet. He just clearly wanted to do it privately, and I respected that. She looked over at the house. Your mother would have liked him. She had very specific ideas about what kind of man was worth keeping. Sawyer fits the description. I told her I agreed, mostly. We had our 7th anniversary dinner in March at a restaurant in Portland we'd been going to since our second date. The kind of place that knows your order and doesn't make a whole thing of it. Sawyer brought a small card, which is not something he typically does, so I noticed it. Inside, he'd written exactly 8 words. I should have trusted you with it from the start. That was it. No grand gesture. Just the admission in his handwriting that I had been right. I kept the card. I also kept my mother's letter, folded back into thirds, in the window seat compartment where we found it. That felt like where it belonged. The house is ours now. We're renting it month to month to a family with 3 kids and a dog, but we're talking, slowly, carefully, about what it would look like to make it ours again in a more permanent way. Nothing decided. Just talking. Pearl still lives next door. We have her over for coffee on weekends when we visit, and she tells me things about my mother I didn't know. Small things, neighbor-sized things, the kind that don't make it into eulogies but that add up over time to a whole person. How my mother used to stand on the porch in the evening with a mug of tea and just watch the street go quiet. How she planted that maple tree because she'd read somewhere that they were good for birds. I think about those 3 weeks sometimes. The bank records, the investigator's flat voice on the phone, the drive past the house with my pulse loud in my ears. I kept Hector's report in a folder for a while, not sure what to do with it. Eventually I threw it out. Not to pretend it hadn't happened, but because the story it was trying to tell turned out to be the wrong story entirely. There's a version of this where I demanded an explanation the morning I found his truck on Birchmore Lane, where I came home and confronted him directly, and he told me everything in our kitchen over cold coffee. That version would have been simpler, certainly less expensive, and it would have saved me 3 weeks of sitting with a suspicion that looked like one thing and turned out to be something else. But I think I might have heard it wrong if he'd told me like that. Some morning explanation before either of us had somewhere to be. I think I might have taken it in as a nice story, without understanding what it cost him to do, quietly, without anyone watching, for 14 months. Sometimes love needs to be found out. Sometimes you have to open the wrong door and stand in the middle of what it built before you can really see it clearly. My mother never got to live in her house again, but someone kept the promise she planted there before she left. A letter tucked under a window seat cushion, in the handwriting I would know anywhere. And I know it's there now, Because my husband spent 14 months and more Saturday mornings than I can count making sure I would.